Hey, howdy, hi. Welcome back to my channel. Thank you so much for stopping by to join me today. I really do appreciate it. My name is Ellie, and I'm a witch. And this over here is my teaching assistant, Andy, and today is Tuesday, and on my channel that means it is tea time and true crime. And today's true crime case does not involve blood or gore or murder, instead fraudulent activities that almost took down the American economy. Today we're going to be talking about the Great Salad Oil Swindle. If you're not interested in true crime, however, I do have two other series on my channel. On Sundays I talk about cryptids, and on Mondays I talk about history. This last Sunday I talked about the cryptids of Texas, and on Monday I talked about the Oakville blobs. And without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into the video. So today's story is a little bit of a longer one, so hopefully you can follow along as best you can. So our story starts with a 16-year-old Anthony or Tony DeAngelis in New York City in 1931. Now, Tony was 16 years old and borrowed $500 from his father. The money was invested in a candy shop, which was risky at the time given the current depression. Unfortunately, the candy shop did close and the money was lost. Tony, however, was not deterred, and he wanted to make a name for himself, and he was going to work towards that goal regardless of this setback. Tony began working at a fish market where he was able to become a manager within 3 years. He then transferred to working at a pig processing plant. Now, he stayed there until 1938, at which point he had not only experience but a sizable savings, which he used to invest in M&D Cutters, which was a New York butchery, and an investment that returned $300,000 3 years later. At the end of World War II, Tony had started a meatpacking company of his own. Now, it actually catered to a foreign market, and he landed an order from Yugoslavia. Now, the Yugoslavian government asked for $1 million worth of lard, but they received a spoiled product. Now, Tony was sued over this incident, but was able to settle for only $100,000. With the extra money, he was able to buy major shares of Adolf Global Company, a New Jersey meat packer. He was able to become president through his shares, during which he was able to secure a contract with local schools. It was around this time that schools were starting to be required to provide free or low-cost options for lunch for students. They accepted limited food products and had price restrictions. Now, this contract helped the company, and they soon had an order for 19 million pounds of smoked meat. Now, Tony only delivered 2 million pounds of inedible meat. Now, once again, Tony took no responsibility and simply blamed a mix-up. He paid $100,000 for the spoiled product, but within months he had been blacklisted from federal contracts, and as a result, Tony was fired and the company went bankrupt. But Tony was only looking ahead. He saw the potential in soybeans, and rightly so. Tony saw a future of soybean oil sales to foreign countries, and he started working towards the goal. He spent $500,000 to create Allied Crude Vegetable Oil Refining Corporation in 1955. This was established in Bayonne, New Jersey, about 1,000 miles from the soybean fields of the Midwest. He had bought a petroleum storage facility and converted the over 150 tanks, which were about 50 feet tall each, into a soybean oil refinery. His plan was to corner the market, so he was the only soybean oil seller. Buying soybeans at a high price and selling it low meant the profits were exceptionally low, but no other sellers could beat his prices. The first step, though, was to get someone in the middle since the refinery was so far from the fields. Now, at first people laughed at him, but he continually set up meeting after meeting with exporters. He was very successful and managed to open 12 businesses under his company's name. Tony was also able to use the Food for Peace program to expand his business. Now, Food for Peace was a way for the US to help combat the food crisis in foreign countries and allow less food to be wasted in the US. Now, thanks to his business prowess, Tony became incredibly wealthy, as did the 22 core employees who were well compensated for their loyalty and silence. Tony also had his ways to avoid persecution. He was accused by the SEC of falsifying a lard inventory, but the star witness in the case was supposedly too sick to stand trial. Then the IRS sued Tony for tax evasion to the tune of $1.5 million. But this case was settled with Tony paying a $50,000 fine and then setting up payments to be sent every 3 months for 10 years. The USDA also went to action when they sued Tony for stealing $1.2 million from the Food for Peace program, but Tony paid $1.5 million and the case was dropped. Tony had also secured a $70 million contract to send oil to third world countries, but the containers that he shipped them in leaked most of the product, However, he just claimed the storage conditions in the third world countries were to blame, not him. The fines and lawsuits continued to roll in, but it wasn't something that worried Tony. The cost to shut down the lawsuits was minuscule compared to what he'd been bringing in thanks to these massive contracts. But Tony wasn't done. He was not satisfied with his current income and lifestyle, so he needed to rig the game just a little bit more. Using his oil refinery as collateral, he started working on getting loans from banks. To do this, he hired an authenticator to verify how much oil he had in his tanks in total. He would then take these receipts to the bank, and that was good enough for the banks. Specifically, Tony started working with American Express. At the time, they had just created another branch of the company, which was American Express Field Warehousing. The field warehousing branch was set up to just verify stock of the warehouse, and then when they verify that, they would then give the company a receipt, and that was taken to the bank to get a loan using that quantity of stock as collateral. When Tony began to interact with the company, it was pretty close to closure, but Tony was seen as the solution. Using the warehouse receipts from Amex, Tony was able to get loans from 51 companies, some of those being Chase Manhattan, Procter & Gamble, and Bank of America. For all these 51 transactions, Amex got a portion as payment from the different companies. Now, this all seemed decent. There was just a little problem with it. Not one person realized that the authenticators in Tony were claiming that he had inventory levels that were higher than the USDA's national inventory counts. Tony accomplished this by the simple fact that oil floats on water. The authenticators did not measure the entire tank in order to verify how much oil the tanks hold. Instead, they opened the tanks and measured just a foot or so of the product. This meant that Tony only needed to add about 2 feet of oil to the tank and the rest could be salt water. There was some talk that this was a scam, but every time there was an inspection, Tony passed it, silencing all the accusations. Though Tony did end up in a bit of a predicament when he received a contract from Spain. They wanted 275 million pounds of oil. Now the contract was for $36.5 million. The problem was that Tony did not have that much oil at the time to fulfill the order, so he needed to purchase futures in order to meet the demand. However, once he bought the futures, Spain pulled out of the deal, not trusting Tony to follow through. Now he had to figure out what the best course of action would be since the money was already spent. Since he had bought on margin, he was going to hold out and sell when prices were at a high. And then just to kind of explain futures, from what I understand, it's kind of like stocks, as in it's an investment rather than the purchasing of a product. Therefore, it would make total sense for Spain to pull out of the deal immediately. I did ask an older coworker if he knew what it was and what it meant in the terms of fulfilling a contract, and he just looked at me and told me it was definitely a scam, and then told me to look into Enron. And if you have a better explanation, or I misunderstood, please edit in the comments. It is very, very difficult to find information. The other term that I use is bought on margin, and this just means to borrow money from a broker in order to purchase more stock. This is essentially a loan from a brokerage company. Now, Tony was still undeterred and pushed forward. In 1963, he saw success in the Russian sunflower crop failure. He used the failure to tell Russia that they needed his oil as a result, and they bought it. He was also working with Wall Street, getting Williston and Bean on board. Soybean speculations created a drive of people buying in. Tony was able to buy 1.2 million pounds of soybean oil, meaning any small changes to the market price would mean an incredible loss or gain. Luckily for Tony, the fall of 1963 spelled money. Soybean oil prices per pound rose from $9.20 to $10.30, which was an incredible rise, and Tony thought it meant that he was in the clear. Until November 15th, when the US Senate stopped negotiations related to wheat exports to Russia. People began to speculate that soybean and cottonseed oil were next on the chopping block. Fortunately for Tony, November 15th was also the same day that the USDA showed up and demanded to see his books. As a result, soybean oil prices per pound dropped to $7.60, and Tony was bombarded with calls from confused bankers. Panic, though, was not in Tony's vocabulary. Instead, he kept calm and planned to sell Allied and simply split the oil among the new owners based on the Amex receipts. However, this is when companies began to look at the tanks themselves to verify the amounts of oil was correct, and as we all know, it wasn't. Not only were they learning that most of the tanks were empty, or mostly salt water, or contained unusual oil, but that Amex had not been doing the authenticating themselves, instead allowing an Allied employee to climb to the tank and shout down the level of oil that was in it rather than authenticating. It was found that only 110 million pounds was accounted for when Tony and Amex claimed there was 1.8 billion pounds of product. 4 days after the initial investigation, Ira Hupton Co., along with Williston and Bean, were suspended from the stock exchange. Ira Hupton Co. was forced to liquidate, while Williston and Bean were forced into a merger. Overall, Amex's stock dropped 50% and $210 million in lawsuits. The field warehousing branch was sent into bankruptcy, and as a result, 20 companies went under and an additional $200 million in losses. And this is where Warren Buffett makes his entrance into the story. Though he's not well known at the time, he saw the failure as his chance to make a name for himself. He bought 5% of American Express for just $20 million and was able to turn that into 50 million shares, or about 21.1% of the company. Tony was not one to take responsibility, though. He blamed the USDA and the entirety of Midwestern agriculture for his failures, positing that 16 of the largest grain dealers worked together to create the company Vegetable Oil Export Company, specifically to take him down. Tony did, however, plead guilty to fraud and conspiracy in 1965, being sentenced to 20 years. He only did 7 years and was released in 1972, making the statement, "I did wrong and I paid the penalty. I have friends all over the world who would be glad to help me rehabilitate myself." This is not the end of the story, though. Upon release, Tony returned to the meatpacking industry, establishing Rex Pork Incorporated in North Borgen, New Jersey. Just a few years after his release, the USDA was knocking once again. This time they were investigating an accusation that Rex Pork was not delivering $3.5 million worth of hogs. On that matter, Tony said, "Everybody's going for a Pulitzer Prize. Who's the easiest fellow to pick on? Someone who's been to jail. It's like Nixon. A fellow gets in trouble and everybody lays on him." Now that is not the only comment that was made surrounding the issue. To the Des Moines Register, Tony said, "I don't care what you put in your paper, but if you ever publish anything about me and it's untrue, I'll cut your effing throat from ear to ear. You can record this. I did 15 years in prison and nobody's ever gonna hurt me again." Now his big thing at this time was purchasing livestock and then not paying. Before long, he was being sued by the government and pled guilty to $7 million worth of livestock fraud. This time being sentenced to 7 years in prison in 1980, but he was out in just 3. In 1984, he became the general manager of Enfield's Natural Lean Pork Company, though he had not given up on his fraudulent lifestyle. By the 1990s, he was using forged letters of credit from the Savings Bank of Finger Lakes in order to buy pork. Then in 1993, Tony pled guilty to interstate transport of fraudulent securities. He was again sentenced, but shortly paroled, and he ended up passing away in 2009, likely taking many secrets to the grave. And that is all that I have for you today. Today's case was a fun one. I really had a lot of fun researching it because it just didn't end. And it just fascinates me that he was clearly so in the wrong, and he admitted it the first time that he was in the wrong, and then did it again. Please, if anybody has an explanation of futures, please explain it to me like I'm 5, because I tried so hard to find information and it was just trying to sell me futures, and all that I got from my older coworker was it's a scam, and then told me to look into Enron, which is one of the biggest scams that I have ever heard of, and I knew what that was when he said it. I didn't have to research it, so that'll tell you something, but I still don't understand what it is. Please help. But yeah, I hope that you guys enjoyed this video as much as I enjoyed researching it. It was just a roller coaster, and I was hoping at any point he would have stopped, but he didn't. But yeah, I'm enjoying this taking a break from murder, at least, maybe every other week. I don't know if I'll continue to do every other week, because it is really hard to find not murder related true crime cases when the market is so just saturated with true crime and murder documentaries and serial killer investigations. So I'm trying my best, but I don't know if I can keep up with it every single week, or every other week I should say. But next week I will be talking about the cryptids of Maine. I will be talking about Ivan VI for history, and then I will be talking about the Bloody Benders for true crime. But if you guys like this video, if you want to hit that thumbs up button, we really appreciate it. Maybe check out what Andy was doing when he was gone for that whole week. It's not on me, it's on him. But follow him on Instagram, say hi perhaps. But yeah, I hope you guys have a great rest of your day, and I will see you next week. Bye!